Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Joining me today is Patrick McGee, the San Francisco correspondent for the Financial Times and the author of Apple in China, the capture of the world's greatest company. His book takes us inside Apple's extraordinary rise in China, the compromises it made along the way, and what that story reveals about the future of technology and geopolitics as well. It's a New York Times bestseller too. And Patrick, thank you very much for agreeing to do this and welcome. Thanks for joining in.
My pleasure, Abhishek. Love talking about the book.
Thank you. And it's a proper door stopper, as they say, because before we started recording this, I was talking about how it does not have trivia that we have gotten used to about Steve Jobs and Wozniaks of the world. And it reveals stuff about China, which I thought, why hasn't anybody written a book before you did? So when did you first get the idea of, piecing this together and that there was something in it?
So I was an Apple reporter for 4 years at the Financial Times, and I realized basically in the final year that I didn't really understand how Apple products were made. I mean, I had read most of the Apple books. I knew how they were designed, and I could sort of reiterate that. But there's several origin stories, but one of them was actually speaking to one of these chip design companies and them telling me that during COVID, they couldn't get into Taiwan easily to be in the fabs. And I said, right, but you design the chips, you don't make them, so why do you need to be in the fabs? That's like an okay question if you don't know what you're talking about. But the naivete or sort of amateur hour-ish question of that in retrospect is horrifying, because to understand how the likes of NVIDIA or Qualcomm or even Apple designs their own chips is in order to do that, they're absolutely in the fabs. They're working hand in glove with those teams. And I think anyone familiar with chips would know that, but I didn't really know that. And the person said, when I basically admitted I didn't know that, they said, well, it's just like Apple. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Apple engineers are in the Foxcons of the world producing phones? And they said, absolutely. And I just had never considered it before. Now, kind of in my defense, I feel like we've never really reported on that before either, right? So it was really like an embarrassment of my own ignorance about how Apple actually worked with hundreds of suppliers across China that got me fascinated by the topic. And then wanting to educate myself, I realized that virtually nothing had been written. I don't want to say totally nothing. Wayne Ma in The Information had done some good stories over the year, and I think he's a great reporter, but certainly not big magazine articles, certainly wasn't part of the popular understanding. You got nothing from, let's say, the Walter Isaacson biography, which is not a diss about him. He's writing a biography of Jobs. Jobs never went to China, so it's not part of his narrative. But it just struck me that Apple, when, put it this way, when Steve Jobs dies, who takes over, right? It's the operations guy. And so Apple knows internally the contributions of its operations team. And yet, as part of like the popular culture or popular understanding of the company, there was almost nothing written on the subject. And so what that allowed me to do is sort of use the challenge of writing about Apple, which is the fact that they're really a secretive company, and sort of pull a jujitsu trick to use that to your advantage. Because if you start talking to the manufacturing design engineers, the procurement specialists, the people setting up factories in China, every time you get them on the phone, they're telling you stuff you don't know, which is why the book is just filled with 3 decades worth of details that's largely new on every page of the book, because I rely very little on what's been reported before. And instead, it's just interview after interview after interview, chronologically ordered, of telling a story that I don't think I knew at all. And I was an Apple reporter. So if I didn't know it as an Apple reporter, the chance that the reader knows are very slim.
Yeah. And one of the staggering statistics from your book, it comes right at the beginning, is that Apple, by its own volition, has trained over 28 million workers since 2008, is what you say, in China. And the word trained is what, caught my attention. As a layperson sitting here in India, what I perceive contract manufacturing to be is, or any of the Apple products, it very cleanly says designed in California, made in China. So it was more like you get a design, you get some people in China to manufacture it on an assembly line in sweatshop conditions, and you get your iPod or iPhone. But if you can explain, you have people from Apple housing themselves in Foxcons of the world for weeks or months together to teach them how to do it. And they're doing this not by following best practices, is what you write. So if you can just explain how that whole machinery works, which is quite intriguing.
So first of all, the number has actually been updated since I published the book, and I only recently came across it. So it's now 30 million since 2008. This is a number publicly available that comes out from Apple. So yeah, as I put it, larger than the labor force of California. And just an incredible number. The other thing is that it's not just Foxconn. I sort of use Foxconn, and you probably use Foxconn as a sort of byword for like partner in China. But one thing worth knowing is that there are hundreds of partners in China. Foxconn is doing the final assembly, and it's often doing some of the adjacent tasks as well. It sort of sits in the center of what then becomes an industrial cluster with all these suppliers being attracted to come around it, right? And so take something like Corning glass. Often that is made in Kentucky, in America, but it's shipped over to China. And Corning makes glass by the meter, right? Multiple meters wide, multiple meters long, or in height. And it needs to be cut, tempered, shaped, and etched, and then placed, right? And that's all done in China. So what happens is like for years, people would sort of disassemble an iPhone. In fact, I've got a disembodied iPhone in front of me as artwork on the wall. And then you can sort of place a little flag as to where each of the components are coming from. And you'll get the impression that, oh, it's a really global supply chain and maybe not that much happens in China. But the problem with that is that the innovations and the contributions, if you will, of Chinese suppliers are not always in the components themselves. And therefore, when you're breaking up an iPhone, you don't necessarily see a bunch of actual Chinese components. You'll see TSMC chips from Taiwan. You'll see memory from Korea, displays from Korea. But how it's actually fit into there, or how the metal stamping is done, or how the chassis is made, so much of that is done in China. So the contributions aren't necessarily within the phone in China. It's the processes behind them. But importantly, over the last 5-10 years, there's been real pressure on Apple to have more of the value-added components in China as well. So it's kind of a both-and story. The original iPhone, I think you could say, yes, there was a lot going on in China, but it's true that it was a lot of foreign components. Over time, it's become more Chinese. And the labor intensity of putting it all together is mind-blowing. I mean, we're talking about 3 million people in the supply chain just in China on an annual basis working on Apple products. I think I answered most of the things I wanted to say there. So yeah, 30 million. Last thing, most companies that are in China are chasing price. That's what attracts them. The low price, the ubiquity of labor. Apple doesn't chase price. Apple chases quality. That is what matters more than anything else. Once they've reached the quality levels, then they try to bring the prices down. But the most important part of my 3-decade narrative, I think, the sort of contribution it makes to Apple, our understanding of Apple, is that because Apple chases price, when they go to China, they face a problem of China doesn't have the tech competence. And so the answer is we need to train up the teams to acquire the competence, to acquire the Apple quality, and then build at what becomes mind-bogglingly large quantities as well. So for Apple to find the quality in China, they needed to build the quality. They need to train. And that's where you get this crazy figure of how much they invested and how many people they had to train. And it's just because Apple, as an engineering culture, has like zero tolerance for defects. They really build something at the quality of like a medical device that might kill you if it's done poorly. Right? Because even if 99% of iPhones work, if you're selling 230 million of them a year, you can't have 2.3 million not working because only 99% worked. So they need to have everything just absolutely humming. And so that's like the technological transfer that takes place. It's not just an engineering skills that gets transferred. It's a culture of caring to the smallest thing within the phone. Every rivet has to be at the highest quality, which is one last thing. This is also why it's not an anti-Apple book. If you just want to write a screed against Apple, of course, what you're not going to emphasize is that they're total perfectionists. They are total artists, right? It is engineering at the highest level. And so you only get to like the really good narrative in a sense by understanding how different and superior Apple is in how they design and engineer their products. But the question I'm asking and trying to answer, which I don't think has really been asked before, is what does it mean to take that culture from Steve Jobs and Jony Ive and in effect transplant it at epic scale in a foreign country, just as that country becomes authoritarian and belligerent?
Yeah, and while we as consumers of Apple products or fans, quote unquote, of Steve Jobs that are in millions, have seen him unveil the iPhone. There is this YouTube video which is quite popular and there are stories around it. But there is a certain structure within the organization that you write about which fosters this creativity, or with your backs against the wall, or they're always pushing each other. If you can just explain the bit about the industrial design team, the product design, and then the manufacturing design that you lay out so well in the book. Because let's say in manufacturing organizations, you always have the R&D and the manufacturing team. They're pulling in different directions because one tries to challenge the other. The manufacturing team says, no, we can't do it. But in Apple, this was bread and butter. Can you explain the hierarchy with a couple of examples of how they got around creating this beast and then they transplanted that in China as well?
Yeah, so this hadn't been written either. Internally, Apple talks about the pyramid structure. So if you just sort of picture a pyramid like this, and it's actually more like an upside down funnel because it goes so wide. So it's almost like really thin, and then it's just like hilariously wide. I just thought that was too complicated for the book. So at the tip of the pyramid is industrial design. So in the golden age of Jony Ive controlling the team, you can think about this being a team of about 24 people, and they're really thinking about the contours, the texture, the materials used to build something. So if we're thinking about the translucent candy-colored iMac or the white iPod with the dial and the chrome back, like ID is the one making those decisions, and they have a sort of godlike presence at the company. In a sense, what they say is how it will be, unless you are able to basically prove that they've defied physics in their attempt to build something, right? The common joke was you'd have to drive the car off the cliff to prove that the brakes don't work. They sort of hand it over to product design. You could think of PD as basically trying to make one of what they've come up with. So they're the team that has to figure out like what circuit boards are we using, what batteries are we using, and how do you fit inside the dimensions of what ID has stipulated. And the way I'm describing it, it makes it sound like they're just sort of like taking the marching orders from ID, but they're brilliant in their own way. So for instance, the original iPhone has a circuit board that is in effect like a sandwich, like it's folded in two just to sort of create more room. And that was because they needed so much more room for other components or a bigger battery so that it had a longer life. And you have to be brilliant to come up with things like that. I should just tell a funny anecdote. I've got a Mac Mini in front of me. That's, like the small computer. And when that was being originated, I think around 2003, 2004, Jony Ive was speaking to one of his engineers and he said, could you make it such and such size? And the PD guy said, oh yeah, no, absolutely. And he goes, okay, well, what if I lower the dimensions to, this and this? Could you do that? And the guy goes, oh, absolutely. And Jony Ive says, okay, well, what if I narrow it even further and do this dimensions? And the PD guy says, oh, I wouldn't be able to do that. And he's like, great, those are the dimensions. So Jony is really trying to push what is even possible. Yeah. And there's lots of examples of that in the book. And actually the early chapters are about what you would call, I think, a failure of Jony Ive, that his original design for the candy-colored iMac literally cannot be built. I mean, PD is just unable to do it, and they would basically say, maybe it doesn't defy physics, but it defies the tools we have. We are unable to make one of these, let alone hundreds of thousands. And that dynamic is really, really interesting. I mean, I'm ridiculously proud of those early chapters where I'm giving you a sort of like 7-year journey of what I call Apple's long march to China, where they're experimenting with suppliers and contract manufacturers in 8 or 9 countries before they really get lured into China. But it's such a rah, go Apple narrative because they're almost bankrupt in 96, 97, 2000. And they really just like are stumbling in fits and starts, and they get hit by the dot-com crisis and all kinds of stuff. It's really quite an interesting narrative in the early chapters before China even enters the picture. Anyway, sorry, so that's ID, right? Sort of throws it over the fence to PD, and then PD basically throws it over the fence to MD, manufacturing design. These are the teams that really hadn't been discussed before. Certainly, I had never read anything about them before, and I went looking. And these are the teams that figure out, okay, so we've got a product, right? PD knows what batteries are going to be used, etc. Our job is to go to Asia to find the relevant suppliers. So they need to find someone that has ultra competence, but also isn't so saturated with other orders because we're going to need a lot of their time and we're going to need their best engineers. So they're not really going to like blank slate factories, right? Like they have to find someone who's already competent in some certain form, but isn't going to be up to the scale or up to the task of Apple. And therefore, Apple has these engineers going over and trains them. Once they've figured out how to work with some contract manufacturers and some suppliers to get it done, in a sense, it then gets thrown over the fence to operations, and operations finds rival suppliers, rival contract manufacturers. And what that does is they're able to cut costs, and at this point, they've achieved quality. At this point, they are going after cost, right? So to negotiate from one supplier to the other to bring things down. And they are building resilience into the supply chain by having multiple options and frankly being very deliberate about that to make sure that no supplier thinks they have leverage over Apple. So ID, PD, MD, Op. tops. That's the pyramid. And it's a pyramid because they get bigger as the thing goes down. So you start with 24 people.
Right.
By the time you get to operations, you're talking about thousands of people. And if you're actually including the suppliers, you're talking about millions of people. So that's why I said upside down funnel. Last thing, the way I describe it, and actually the way I write it in the book, it sounds like these are distinct processes that are linear in time. You start with this, and then you go to the other one. It's kind of like that, but the key thing is that it's concurrent. So it's all happening at the same time. So operational breakthroughs lead back into the possibilities of design and aesthetics so that Jony Ive is then able to sort of realize what's going on. So even though the tasks are clearly delineated, it's not the case that sort of they're not speaking to each other until they reach the final stage. It's all happening at the same time, which is sort of mind-boggling to figure out, but that's absolutely key.
Right. In other words, if somebody has to build a component that needs to go in the overall unit, and if the tool to make that component is not there, they will figure out a way to build that tool itself, right, in the factory. It goes down to that extent.
So what you have to understand, especially, and I don't know how true this is now, but especially in the golden age of Jony Ive, is that they would come up with something, right? And the PD team or the MD team would look at it and be like, I have no experience knowing how to build that, right? So I hope I can swear on your podcast, but what I was told was like the ideal thing you could say to ID is, I have no fucking idea how to do what you're asking me, but give me some time, I'm going to go figure it out.
Yeah.
That was the ideal temperament you could have it up.
Right. And I'm imagining that there would be fights, and we all talk about this teamwork and innovation and collaboration. There is a company which here in this case has illustrated that for over decades. How would they set aside their differences, and at what point would Jony Ive in this case probably was the king in that hierarchy in terms of his disposition or dealing with people? And for a moment, I might digress. It's nothing to do with China. It's to build some products which are, customer first. It's easy as a bullet point on a PowerPoint presentation, but how would they go about it? And how was he as a person who was leading the charge while Steve Jobs would make those presentations, but he was the man behind it all, right? So how would he handle these things?
So the other thing worth knowing is just that ID does have this godlike presence. So you can't just say, that's difficult, I don't want to do that, right? So if Jony Ive had come up with something that literally couldn't be done, you would have to come back to him with reams of experimentation and essentially proof, like mathematical proof, right? That what he was asking for could not be made. But otherwise, you would just be off the project if you couldn't get it done. So, I mean, the book has some great examples early on where, Steve Jobs is effectively told at this meeting, like, look, sorry, we've been trying for weeks, we've been trying for months, we've lost some of our best people through attrition trying to get this done, but it cannot be done. And so Steve Jobs, fairly new to the company at this point, right? This is his second coming period, in a sense, doesn't know if the PD team is unable to execute because of their incompetence or because they really have been handed something that isn't possible. So he goes to his favorite, this is a great anecdote, also new to the book. He goes to his favorite design consultancy at the time called Acorn. And Acorn was actually born out of two guys that had worked on the Next Cube computer, right? This magnesium cube that Steve Jobs and team had designed at Next Computer. So he really respected sort of the engineering and the plastic injection molding prowess of these two guys, and you knew them personally. So all these Apple PD guys show up at this Acorn design consultancy, and they unroll blueprints onto the table, and they go through the design for hours. And those two guys basically determine, you don't have a quality product. Like, this can't be built. So they side with the PD team, and Jony Ive and team, again, new to the story, have to go basically redesign how things are going to be done. And then they're able to proceed. And then it goes over to Korea to be built. But I was so happy figuring out this narrative because there's so much about Jony Ive where, you have this image of him when he's 13 years old and here he is really liking minimalist designs or something, right? And it's just like, sorry, Jony Ive's like everybody else. He made mistakes. He got to where he was through hard work, through making mistakes. Through improvement, right? And so our image of Jony is just that, like, he's just this perfect, like, deity of design from the get-go. And come on, that's just nonsense. He made some mistakes and he realized that he had set tasks that weren't possible, and he had to make more of an effort to go to Asia, go to Japan, work with suppliers and understand the materials, the processes, the machinery in a way that he had never had to do before. And that's instrumental to the early narrative, just how much impact and how much work goes into it.
Right. Yeah, I also like one little story where he sits and apologizes to one of his colleagues from the other department, where he says, "Sorry, I think that was an impossible task, and I wouldn't have wanted to be in your shoes when you were getting that hair dryer treatment from Steve Jobs or some such." If I'm remembering that piece, so that shows the humility as well. It's not just wielding a sword and asking people to do things his way. Then,
yeah, I mean, basically, if ID assigns something that can't physically be done, like that's a major failing on their part, and so that happens at a time where if the candy-colored iMac couldn't be built, and it's actually months behind schedule, like as described in the book, that would have been the end of the company. I mean, straight up, that I was told that by multiple people at Apple. Steve Jobs probably has said as much as well, but I mean, the company is gonna die. I have these great meeting notes that I found and used for the first time in the book, where Steve Jobs in 1997, looking forward, he's confident about the company still being around in 5 years, but only if they can make it through that first 12 months. And he's looking at the portfolio and going, I don't know what we're selling in the next 12 months in order to get over that first hurdle and then be around in 5 years. And he says it doesn't look like the roadmap of a company that's going to survive. And so everything hinges on the candy-colored iMac being a success. And it comes pretty damn close to failure, and just we would never even have seen a prototype. I mean, it's very early stages. It just does not work, and it doesn't work for months.
And at what point did Apple realize over time, once they started building these products, that China was a country that they could bank on? Because even you said Steve Jobs didn't visit China, so it was some of their subordinates, and one of them put their hand up that the person could speak Chinese or Mandarin, and then that person goes there and figures out a whole new world. So just talk me through that bit, because that was new as well.
So wait, you're conflating two things. So the guy who puts up his hand to say, hey, I speak Mandarin fluently, that's a retail story. So that's someone wanting to open the first Apple store, and that's in 2008. The story about how they're lured to China is interesting because, in a sense, it's not an Apple story. It's a supply chain story, which is to say, in the 80s and the 90s, you really have the birth of what Thomas Friedman called like the flat world, right? Where in a certain theoretical sense, anybody could contribute to electronics products insofar as they were being built with standardized interchangeable parts, right? If your team in Taiwan really leveraged the fact that you had low labor rates in 1985 and you wanted to build for Dell or HP, you could damn well get your footprint into the PC, because you could just really focus on some part of the computer. And if you had the right team, the right aesthetic, you could sort of power your way in that and become a world leader in that. And Taiwan essentially does that, and eventually sort of like goes further into the computer and ends up, being a dominant player in things like motherboards for the computer. But Apple is a company that wants more control than anybody else, and they care more about aesthetics more than anybody else. And so they're never going to be able to play the game of standardized interchangeable parts. Because they're building computers in such a different fashion, they can't rely on the same things that HP and IBM are relying on. The more they do that, the more they're just going to be killed, because the whole thing that Steve Jobs has to emphasize when he comes back is not standardization, it's differentiation. It's what makes the Apple product different, therefore it's worth a different premium, and you're willing to learn a different operating system, because 95% of the world is using the PC Windows platform. So we can't play the battle, we can't win the battle that the PC game is being played on. So they need to do something else, and that's how they redefine the nature of the computer. But it's all these different suppliers who are competing for the likes of HP and Compaq and so forth, that themselves are moving over to Asia as a way of winning the supply contract for the motherboard, for the chassis, for the assembly, right? So if I'm in Taiwan and everybody else is in Taiwan, well, just across the strait is mainland China, just emerging, and after 2001, they're in the World Trade Organization. The labor rates there are ridiculously much lower, and so they begin to build up these factories, right? This is really the origins of Foxconn and others. These are Taiwanese entrepreneurs going over to mainland China and setting things up. And so the whole industry just sort of moves from, first of all, America over to Asia, and then from sort of broader Asia to China directly. And so I really take issue with the idea that Tim Cook is the architect of the move to China. This is sort of what he's been called the last 20 years. I'm not trying to dismiss his value here. He's obviously got great value, but there is no architect. It's not that he has this great idea of why don't we move to China. Everything is just moving to China, and they just ride that wave better than anybody else. So it's a story of Apple sort of surfing the 4 decades of globalization, but not actually actively choosing China. They sort of get lulled into it. And in my retrospective analysis, of course, they sort of sleepwalk into it in just an engineering, low cost, let's build the quality sense of it, without really understanding the repercussions in a geopolitical sense of what it will mean to put all your eggs in one basket. And that's a problem on its own, let alone that Xi Jinping comes into power and sort of very much changes not just the internal dynamics of the country, but how foreign entities within China are treated and what's expected of them.
And what set them apart very clearly from whatever I've read in your book is the speed at which China does things. And when you talk about countries, let's say like Vietnam or even India, being possible substitutes to China, I feel that's never going to be possible. Because some of the examples that you give where there's absolutely nothing one day, a landfill, but a guy tells the Apple executive that probably a few months down the line, we will have a factory going there or some such. If you can give a couple of examples for the listeners to just determine the scale of speed, because it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with a personal anecdote. When I was in China in 2016 or so, I remember being confused because I was sitting there with some such book like Lonely Planet, and I was right in front of a new high-speed rail line. But I couldn't find it on the map I was using. And the book had only been published the prior calendar year. Maybe it was 10 months ago, maybe it was 18 months ago, I don't know. But basically what I learned within a few minutes is that it had been built so quickly that the writers of Lonely Planet, even a year ago, weren't aware of it, and therefore so they didn't acknowledge it because it didn't exist. But here it was up and running and I could get on the train. That's the kind of experience that Apple engineers were having in China all the time. I mean, one example that I don't use in the book was that, you got this MD team operating in China, and I forget the specifics, but essentially we're talking about like the factory the size of a football field, and it's going to be like reworked, if you will, for Apple production. And it's just filled with machinery that they don't need, and they need to have different machinery come in. And so the team estimates that it'll take, 3, maybe 4 weeks to sort of get it up and running to like Apple standards in terms of like the machinery being in place. And then they come to the factory the next day, it's all been done. Right? And it's just completely inexplicable. So you have these 24/7 teams working, crazy amounts of labor, and just a hard workingness and an ethic of please the clients that I think other countries struggle to replicate. And so, this is why the book can be really interesting, because in order to tell those stories, you have to have the reader sort of understand that China's coming out of what they call their century of humiliation. And, that's sort of a pre-1949 thing when the communist power takes hold. But, Mao, whatever his merits as a military strategist driver, he's a terrible leader of the country. You have one of the world's biggest famines in the 60s. You have the Cultural Revolution, which is a catastrophe for all number of reasons. But I was just reading this in a book, and I was floored by just how recent it all is, right? But there's a constitutional amendment that allows for private businesses, and it's very recent. And so when people who haven't had these opportunities suddenly have them, they're pretty happy to work their asses off to basically really exploit the opportunity as much as they can. And so among the things that's helpful to understand is that, it's not like people growing up going to school in Shenzhen and then getting a factory job, or in Shanghai or in Hangzhou. It's usually people coming from these rural areas who are only there temporarily, in the same way that you might go off to university in America and be somewhere for 4 years. You go off to Shenzhen for 4 years, and you're trying to work as hard as possible, make as many overtime hours as possible, because what you can earn in a year might support your you and your family in a village for 5 to 10 years. And so there's a sense in which when you are there, you are trying to work as hard as possible. And Apple is just able to sort of take advantage of that more than anybody else.
Yeah, and your point about pleasing the client and what lens that companies can go to. I think there is one, Terry Gu of Foxconn, and I'd love for you to talk about him a little bit, how he built the outfit. But the pre-sales pitch to Apple, and I found this mind-boggling, is that those guys actually built a third-generation iPod, which was a fake replica, just to please the client that, hey, look, we know what we are talking about and we can deliver this. Now, that's a different level of commitment just to get business. Can you give an example or two of how Foxconn, in this case, happened to go to great lengths to get certain things done?
So Terry Guo founds Foxconn in 1974 in a shed in a Taiwanese town whose Mandarin names translates into Dirt City. So even more impoverished origins than two Steves in a garage 2 years later coming up with Apple. Massive success story, really interesting, and we probably can't get into it, but why are Taiwanese entrepreneurs in effect building up the technology competence of China, who is in effect the winner of the Civil War, Taiwan being the losers of the Civil War, at least in terms of the leaders fleeing to Taiwan and setting up the modern government that we know today. So, I mean, there's fascinating sort of geopolitical things there, and it allows me to sort of introduce the geopolitics or the geopolitical framing of all of this early on, even before Apple's in China, because the fact that the Taiwanese are in China is already fascinating. A lot more books, actually, I think, need to be written on that, even though a few have been. Okay, so what Terry Guo understands more than anybody else, and earlier than anybody else, is the value of working with Apple is not the profits. They will negotiate the hell out of you, and you'll be either losing money, maybe just earning 1% margin. You're certainly not going to be a fat cat making 15% margins supplying Apple. And so what he recognizes is that the learning is far more profitable in a certain sense than money, right? Money has its uses, but if you can take the skills from Apple engineers training your workforce, you can use those skills to win more contracts. So he gets the sense that nobody designs a computer the way that Jony Ive and Steve Jobs do. So if you can meet those demands, you can absolutely meet Dell's demands or HP's demands. And so they sort of take on Apple as a client to get like the hardware equivalent of Ivy League engineering training. And then they rotate the teams at will, such that when they've learned enough from Apple, they put them on lucrative projects to supply some other competitor. And then they're able to get more employees trained. So Terry Guo is brilliant in that sense. And he's also brilliant working the political system in China to get access to labor, land, machinery, equipment. So I think without Foxconn, Apple has a very different history. Foxconn is absolutely instrumental in many respects and really becomes our most important partner. I mean, even today, a city like Zhengzhou, where Apple does iPhones, there's something like 400,000 people assembling iPhones in that one place alone, and that's Foxconn. So it's hard to underestimate how important they are.
And I quote this line from your book. You write that every dollar he earned was going to the production line, not to the marble floors in the reception area. The whole idea was that every penny, everything was being put back in where it mattered, and not to buy a painting from from an auction.
And I have no doubt that that's true, but you got to understand that Terry's brilliant. And so there's an optics thing that he cares about there, which is to say that he wants to like flagrantly show Apple how uncomfortable his office is, right? It's basically a sea container with a tin roof, because he really wants to like beat you over the head with that image that any money you give us goes to the machinery, goes to the production line. We're all about the clients. This is not about Terry Guo driving a Ferrari.
Right.
At least in the early years. To be clear, later he buys, a $25 million castle in the Czech Republic. But that's after he's made his reputation.
Right. Of building world-class machines is what you write in the factory, and shithole conditions around them is how one of the Apple engineers told you back in '99. That's so the reason why I said that it's hard to imagine some of these things happening in even a country like India. I'm from India and I'm proud of my country, among other things, but it's a different scale, mentality. And of course, it comes at a cost where you don't have democracy there, so you can get away by doing certain things that may not be possible here.
Yeah.
And I think Ricky Gervais did what he did during one of those Golden Globe Awards where he got Tim Cook, threw him under the bus for and everybody cheered and he did not get sued. So yeah, it's a bit of everything, but the scale is at completely off the charts, is what I learned from your book.
So yes and no. I mean, looking back, yes. But it's worth knowing that this design pyramid, or the move to contract manufacturers and then the move to China, this is all happening at a time when Apple is very small, right? When people are joining the company in 2000, even 2001, other people are telling them this is the worst decision you'll make in your life, right? Because nobody expects anything from Apple. And so all the consequential decisions, in the way that like a good novel is written but happens in real life, have these repercussions, but it has them later when Apple's a total Goliath. But it's just worth knowing they weren't that big when they were making these decisions. So like one of the questions I get is like, well, why didn't Apple just make these investments in America? And it's like, well, like everybody was in Asia. If Apple had decided to stay in America, great, but there'd be no iPod and there'd be no iPhone, and Apple would just be some historical testament right now. I mean, they wouldn't have made it. What China was offering is hard to understate. And if we are fast forwarding a little bit to the discussion of what can Apple do in India, Apple can absolutely train great workforces in India. In a sense, it doesn't matter if facilities in India today don't have the Apple quality or the Apple mindset, because they can teach them that. I'm confident in that. The trouble is, once you've built something, is it getting on a high-speed rail track to a world-leading port? Is it getting on an 8-lane highway? That's the kind of stuff that China was ridiculously good at supplementing Apple with, as it were, right? Just the infrastructure beyond the factory. And so if India is going to pull it off, it's less about like, what can Apple do for India, and more about what can India do for Apple. And one of the things that's sort of interesting and pretty well documented in the book is like, China has this version of communism that, very unlike Moscow, isn't top down. It's sort of grassroots would be the wrong term, but like cadres at the local level are actually competing with cities and provinces and other places in the country to win orders and sort of make good on whatever it is that Beijing has set out as like a 5-year plan. And so the way that they're able to like sell land and create these quid pro quos where the cadres and the local municipalities actually sort of get rich off of factory growth, that's the kind of thing that would need to be replicated, because China was able to introduce a form of state capitalism where you don't just have dynamism and creativity on the private side, like in this instance on the part of Apple, you have it on the public side. So, you know, in India probably, but more so where I am in California, if a bureaucrat is involved in your business, like someone from the government, like that's someone who's like holding up environmental standards or talking about like labor rights, whatever, like it's something that's hindering your growth. They might be doing something that's good for society, but they're not helping you, right?
Yeah.
In China, they are helping you. In China, a bureaucrat, like at least in the good scenarios, is someone that's operating like a venture capitalist would, helping teach the company and helping them win orders and gain talent and get migrant labor and make things easy for you, cut the red tape or whatever. So they're acting more like a supporter of your factory rather than like a regulator that's just sort of like imposing or reminding you of zoning rules.
Right. And last few questions. What are some of the things that Apple over time learned from China by sending a few of its people there? We very briefly, and I conflated the retail expansion bit a few minutes ago, where they sent someone who could speak Mandarin. And I loved the human side of it all in the book, where you talk about how he's pulling his hair because what he sees on ground is unprecedented, and he wants to show that to his Cupertino or the headquarters, but they wouldn't get it. And just like any typical big company, they're trying to figure out how big China is, and they're clearly underestimated China altogether. Even Terry Gou said that, look, Mr. Cook, you are underestimating your numbers. This is going to be huge. So you please give us the money and we'll build it for you. So explain China from the point of view of an on-ground Apple employee trying to explain it to the headquarters.
Yeah. There's quite a bit to unpack here. So I want to tell you the short version so that people go read by the book. Okay, so you have to understand that in the mid-2000s, Western executives who got excited about China made the opposite error that Apple made. What I mean by that is they would go to a city like Shanghai and Beijing, sort of take the temperature of what customer taste was or whatever, and then extrapolate to the entire country, right? So by doing so, they would sort of think that the whole country was like these top tier cities and get really optimistic, right? It's like there's some dumb joke from years and years ago about, well, if just 1% of Chinese people, bought the shoes that I'm marketing, right? Like to make it seem like it's some less than fanciful notion. And of course, when you get 1% of 1.5 billion people, you think it's this massive opportunity. But of course, there's nothing like that. And so what happened is Apple growth basically explodes in China, but it's understandable that Apple doesn't see this coming. So what I remind people of is that when the first iPhone comes out in 2007, it's priced at, I think, $499, possibly $599. And Steve Ballmer, Microsoft CEO at the time, famously or infamously laughs at this and says, no one's going to pay $600 for a phone. That's the climate that they're working in at the time, right? The phone's only for America. And the idea is like, no one's going to pay $600 in America. So why would you think, logically, that in a country of depressed wages, right, the reason why they're in China is because it's such a cheap place to build. Why would you assume the iPhone would do well there? I mean, you wouldn't. And so Apple had classified China as a third-tier market after the likes of Uruguay as recently as 2008. They did not think it was going to be a place where they would sell their products, just a place that you would build them. But they get convinced by someone to build a Apple store, an official Apple store, the first one, just ahead of the Beijing Olympics. So the idea is not that there's a big market to sell to. The idea is, hey, 10,000 foreign athletes are all going to be in the city. China was spending lavishly on it. It was very much like the coming out party, 25 years into the reform and opening up period that Deng Xiaoping had initiated. So they just saw it as a marketing idea. And the fact that the store was sort of small was actually considered a plus because it felt certain that they were going to lose money. And so if you had a small footprint, you were probably containing costs, fewer employees, fewer construction costs, and so forth. And instead, it just goes wildly lucrative. I mean, the first year is just like it outmatches expectations, but it's not huge. But by the time of the iPhone 4, which in China is released in October 2010, they just cannot build enough iPhones to satiate demand. And it's my favorite narrative in the book, very much untold in any of the details beforehand. And the basic story is just that these gangsters, known as yellow cows in the country, scalpers essentially, they recognize this vast opportunity that everyone in China wants to own the iPhone. And there's not enough supply within the official Apple stores where you know that they're legit, where it's coming with an Apple Store receipt or whatever. And so they begin, well, first of all, they just ask Apple if they could just buy thousands of them. And of course, the answer is no. You can only buy 2. So they begin bussing in migrants from outside Beijing, outside Shanghai, and having them stand in line where everybody buys 2. And so if you have the image of how an iPhone is built in terms of the conveyor belt production line, where something takes a couple seconds and then it moves on to the next person, this is how they were selling phones in the most lucrative stores that Apple had ever created. And then these gangsters would basically fill an entire bus of iPhones, and they could drive or somehow get the phones to a city like Chongqing, population 32 million. And they would be able to sell the phones there as the monopolist distributor of the phone. And the person who most had to deal with this was the de facto head of all China retail. His name's John Ford. He was a Mormon missionary to Taiwan, so he spoke the language. And more than that, he's not an academic. He had been the CEO of a company for more than 5 years that traveled the world, but lots of the second tier, third tier, fourth tier cities in China to deal with labor audits and a bunch of stuff. So he's developed this street smarts. He's savvy. He understands how the police operate. He understands how to avoid bribes and things like that. And it's just for the author, it was a brilliant find because as the author, you realize you have to handhold the reader so that they understand the dynamics of China, but you can't do that in a textbook way, right? You can't say to understand this, you need to understand, who Xi Jinping is or who Hu Jintao is. You need a character to drive that narrative home so that it's entertaining and you're almost Trojan horsing it where they think they're, reading about this, but actually you're educating them so that they have the right requisite knowledge to go to the next chapter kind of thing. And so he was just a brilliant street smart vehicle to sort of tell that story, that portion of the story. Part 4, it's my favorite part of the book.
Another one of the characters that you write about, and it's not too many pages, but it's packed. And I let the readers pick it up about Tim Cook. Now, when he took over, we all have this perception of a persona of a guy whose attention to details, among other things, is what he is known for. But you also compare him to Immanuel Kant, whose daily routine was so consistent, you write, that residents could set their watch to when he strolled by. And I found it because I work in a place where I need to go through Excel sheets, among others. But tell us about Tim Cook a little bit. I know we are running out of time. Before we wind up, because you also unpack his personality, which people, again, there's no biography of Tim Cook as such, which is very popular and has sold millions of copies, but you cover him as well. How is his working style? How is it different from Jobs? And with some examples.
Yeah, in some ways, he's the opposite of Jobs, but he's sort of the perfect counterpart. So, Jobs doesn't suffer fools. And neither does Tim Cook. Tim Cook sets a standard of minutiae and details on the very first day that he holds a meeting, where instead of 90 minutes, the meeting goes for 13 hours. And it goes that long because his expectations of how well you know the details is just on a level that nobody at Apple had ever really experienced before. I mean, among the funny details is that Apple doesn't assign him an assistant. It assigns him 2 assistants to split the day because he's prone to coming into work at 6 a.m. And then you can't really expect someone to still be there at 10 p.m. But, he's Tim Cook. That's what he's going to do. So they have someone who, stops at 2 p.m. and then someone whose shift starts at 2 p.m. and goes till 10 p.m. Right? He is work ethic incarnate. He is competence incarnate. I don't think he's the most exciting CEO, but that's not a diss. That's just, he doesn't have the flamboyance, the charisma of an Elon Musk or a Steve Jobs, certainly. But he has a perfectionist mindset, and he's intolerant of people not thinking many steps down the road and planning for it. And so the chapter on him, I mean, he's throughout the book, but I have one chapter really introducing him. I recently re-listened to it, and I'm really happy with it because I don't think it's a negative portrayal. I mean, I have publicly called for, Apple to choose a new CEO because I think they're in a different paradigm now where you need product vision, you need product design, you need AI, and I don't think that's what Tim Cook represents. But in my description of what he does bring to the company, I think it's really fair. And look, he brings a lot to the company. I mean, I don't know that there could have been a better senior vice president in operations to really turn chaos into world-leading order in the period 1998 to 2011. I mean, he does a magnificent job. Of course, my book is about the blind spot of what it means to have done that all in a foreign country, just as it turned belligerent. But let's not sort of let that narrative escape from how well he does, because Apple's a failing company when he takes over, and it's world-leading a decade later. And a lot of that has to do with operations rather than just product design.
And the last question, where do you see Apple in general you've been reporting on the company for a while now. Where is Apple in its trajectory from Jobs to Cook? And you said maybe they need a new boss. What is it they're doing right? How long can they continue with their version upgrades or having the new iPhone with a larger screen or an additional camera? Where do you think they are headed, and for better or worse?
So I'm pretty pessimistic, but not necessarily about like the market value of the company. I think it's quite possible that they, quadruple their share in India from 5% to 20% by 2030, let's say, right? I think their hold on the American consumer is very high. Even if, Sam Altman and Jony Ive couple together like they are and come out with some great hardware product that uses AI first in a way that is revolutionary and that, goes beyond the imagination of what I can think of, it's still likely the case that that product augments my iPhone rather than displaces it. I'm sure at some stage it could displace the iPhone, and even Apple has acknowledged that, but that's probably 5 to 10 years down the road. And so, I don't expect people to start ditching their iPhones in favor of Samsung or something anytime soon. But I worry that some of the greatest features to do with AI are not coming out of Cupertino. I don't even think they're really in the conversation. And insofar as I hope that they have some brilliant work where the AI value Apple is adding or giving to consumers is quote unquote on device rather than in the cloud. And the reason that's important is because ChatGPT's budget for data servers can be infinity, and they still can't access my personal text messages, my personal email, the photos I've taken on my phone, etc., because that's all siloed into apps on the phone. And the only entity that has access to that is Apple. So if Apple sort of knocks it out of the park on AI, they can offer you a seamless integration of your apps by you asking Siri something, and Siri goes through 3 or 4 different apps to find the answers and then give it to you, right? So they can do something on device in a way that doesn't rely on the massive, intensive cloud infrastructure that everybody else is doing. Unfortunately, I don't think they're doing that in a good way. They've sort of had to own up to the fact that features that they've advertised haven't come. And they're losing talent in the AI wars to the likes of Meta. And I think if you're a brilliant AI person, you probably have a sense that more is happening at a place like ChatGPT or OpenAI than it is at Apple. So I'm sort of not holding my breath on Apple having some brilliant breakthrough there. But I just want to say the potential is there. The other thing I would say is Jony Ive left the company in 2019. Look, he didn't need to stay forever. It's fine that he left, but he was chief design officer. Who's the chief design officer today? It's been 6 years. The answer is nobody. It's a vacant role. I think that is a travesty. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. My books, opening chapters, are all about the absolutely revolutionary designs that they were putting out into the world.
Yeah.
I look at the last 6 iPhones and I'm bored. They have an announcement, a week or so after this podcast will go out. I don't even know that I'll watch it. I mean, they're not going to do anything interesting on the iPhone that I'm fundamentally going to care about. I'm actually surprised millions of people still watch these things. You think about something like the Mac Mini or the Mac Studio. These are about as boring as the computers Dell was putting out in the late 90s. From a design standpoint. I don't think they've carried on the legacy of Jony Ive at all. And at some point, that's got to matter. But so far, it hasn't.
Jony Ive 2.0, maybe? Will he be called back for all you know to do what Jobs did? So
yeah,
sorry, just
fan fiction for Apple fans. I don't think it's going to happen. But
this is one non-fiction book that I'll urge all the listeners to pick this one up. Patrick, thank you so very much for your time on this podcast and for unpacking some of this. And there is a lot more that we can talk about, but I'm afraid we've run out of time and I have to let you go. But thanks a lot and congratulations yet again on all the accolades on the book.
Thank you, Abhishek. Really, my pleasure.
Thank you. I'm just hitting stop here.